In the previous lecture, we gave a general insight on the concept of neuroplasticity, on what we're going to see throughout this course, and we also briefly discussed how neuroplasticity can change your entire life. Now, as we all know, neuroplasticity is backed up by science. So understanding the scientific approach is necessary. And of course, we need to go above the concept of neuroplasticity itself. We're going to talk about concepts that are related, but that are kind of different. We're going to talk about the brain's gray matter, the synapses in details, and you are going to discover some fascinating concepts that will help you even more when it comes to understanding neuroplasticity. So, according to Wikipedia, gray matter contains most of the brain's neuronal cell bodies. The gray matter includes regions of the brain involved in muscle control and sensory perception, such as seeing, hearing, memory, emotions, speech, decision-making, and self-control. Now, when the proportion of gray matter changes, guess what's going to change as well? Of course, the cell bodies, the synapses, and the neural structure that is formed inside the gray matter. And for those of you who don't know what the gray matter is, it is a tissue inside the brain and the spinal cord that has a lot of nerve cell bodies and branching dendrites that comes from the axons. Until at the end of the 20th century, scientists assumed that gray matter could never increase in adults. But of course, recent research found that this is not true. Now, age is negatively associated with gray matter volume. Elderly people shows lower volumes of gray matters in the brain. Nonetheless, when it comes to neuroplasticity, we look at things in a different way. Every single person, as we said before, whether it's a baby, whether it's a child, whether it's a teenager, an adult, or an elderly person, can be able to change his brain, his neural structure through the concept of plasticity. However, we need to keep one thing in mind. Even though scientists found a lot about neuroplasticity, and even though we got to a point where we can hack our neuroplasticity in a very effective way, we need to keep in mind that the concept of neuroplasticity still has a lot going on. There is an ongoing research about this concept that will not stop until we get to a point where we know everything about it, of course. At this point, there are some things about neuroplasticity that we're not sure of or that we don't actually know. However, going back to our point, research showed that a lot of different aspects of the brain can be altered even through adulthood. And we already talked about this before, and we're also going to mention it later because it's one of the most essential concepts to keep in mind, that no matter how old you are, you can use these methods. Neuroplasticity can be observed at multiple scales, from microscopic changes in individual neurons to larger scale changes such as cortical remapping in response to injury, and we're going to talk about cortical remapping shortly. Now, of course, there is a certain cognitive decline that is related to age, but it may seem that until you actually know the factors in the outlook, you can't base your judgment on age. When people grow up, Benjamin Franklin says most people die at the age of 25, but aren't buried until they're 75. And the reason behind it is because at the age of 25, that's where most people would start their professional journey. Now, being a busy person with a lot of stuff to do, or being someone with nothing to do, you always have something on your mind. And usually, this results in stress, in anxiety, a feeling of being trapped in the life that you currently have. You get opposed to new experiences, your creativity can get blocked, and these are the concepts that affect your brain plasticity, not just aging. So when you get older and you become focused on certain aspects of your life, because you need to be paying bills, you need to find a partner. All of these things become so hardwired in your brain that you kind of let go of everything else. And letting go of everything else is creating a mental block for yourself. Now, we need to keep one thing in mind, is that neuroplasticity is affected by genes as well. So your own human existence can affect your own neuroplastic mind. And adding to it, that the older we get, your brain structure will start to change. So different people have different experiences with their brain's plasticity based on, of course, their age, their genes, and their experiences. Now, previously, we mentioned a concept of cortical maps. Now, cortical maps are areas of many columns in the brain cortex, and they have been identified as performing a specific information processing function. Your entire nervous system is connected to the rest of your body through this cortical map. Now, what does that have to do with anything related to neuroplasticity? And what happens when this cortical map is disrupted? What happens when the sensory input decreases? Now, keeping in mind that the cortical map functions to produce this meaningful perceptual experience of the world, enables us to interact effectively and get into actual thinking, language, and logic. It is very essential to know what's going to happen when there's a certain change to this map. And of course, this change can happen because of a trauma or an injury, as well as it can happen through repetition, behavior, and environmental factors. So when we talk about the previous experience where there's a certain disruption to this cortical map, we endeavor another concept called cortical remapping. So just like every part of the body is connected to a corresponding area in the brain, which creates a cortical map, when there's a certain thing that happens that disrupts this map, such as an amputation, for example, or a change in the neuronal characteristics, the map is no longer relevant. This neuronal change will be dominated by another cortical region that is still receiving input in the cortical map. So, doing a quick recap of these informations, every part of the body is connected to an area in the brain, and this connection is regulated by our cortical map. Now, other cortical regions will dominate over the disrupted inputs when it comes to these damaged cortical regions in case of a certain, of course, disruption or trauma, injury, or change. And what that would do is that it would create a remapped area. So when we talk about neuroplasticity, we're not just talking about neurons and axons. We're talking about the entire nervous system. We're talking about huge, complicated, and complex cortical maps that has been formed over years and years. Neuroplasticity can, through different factors, change the actual cortical map that connects the nervous system to the rest of the body. One of the most fundamental principles underlying neuroplasticity is based on the idea that individual synaptic connections are constantly being removed or recreated, largely dependent upon the activity of the neurons that are bearing them. So let's take the group of neurons as one small dot in this cortical map. So every tiny neural network is a dot in this cortical map. Now, when one dot is removed, the cortical map that's forming a chain is broken. And what the brain does is it would let go of this neural structure that is not working anymore, or that is not very effective, that is not having a lot of stimulation, and it will reconnect two other neural networks together to continue the chain and ensure that the cortical map is working effectively. In fact, ScienceDirect.com talks about this concept of experience-dependent cortical plasticity. What the document says is that Experience-dependent changes in the receptive field and cortical map topography has been reported throughout various developmental stages and sensory modalities. The common principle in these studies is that plasticity seems to be driven by the ability of cortical networks, hence maps, to detect patterns and changes in the spatiotemporal structure of the input to which they are exposed. More specifically, the correlational structure of the inputs to the cortex, or lack thereof, seems to be a primary determinant in the cortical organization. And the document concludes that cortical plasticity allows these circuits to flexibly adjust and optimize processing in a manner that reflects the environmental and behavioral demands. This ability encompasses both relatively simple features such as the formation of topographic maps and the spatial receptive field characteristics of neurons, as well as the processing of complex stimuli such as speech and vocalization recognition, which in a nutshell mean that all the concepts of neuroplasticity and the concepts that affect neuroplasticity that we talked about before can play a detrimental factor when it comes to cortical mapping. Now, moving on to one of the most interesting theories in neuroplasticity. Now, this theory talks about a concept that we already mentioned before and we talked about it briefly, which is the use it or lose it concept. And what Hebbian theory says is that neurons that fire together wire together. Neurons that fire out of sync will fail to link. So on the microscopic level of neurons, this is where plasticity starts. If two close-by neurons produce impulses in close temporal proximity on a consistent and regular basis, their functional properties may change. And in contrast, also talking about a microscopic level of neurons that are not activated simultaneously on a regular basis are, generally speaking, less likely to functionally converge or change, and they are more likely to actually cancel any kind of chain between them. And keeping in mind that this is just the beginning. Once a connection is formed between two neurons, then one of these two neurons would form a connection with a third neuron on the microscopic level. Then this third neuron will form another connection, and eventually these millions of neurons would make one neural network that has a certain specialization or job in the human body in regulating between the nervous system and the human body. Now the thing is, experiences don't make one neuron fire. It doesn't just have an effect on one single neuron. It has an effect on millions of neurons at a time. Every single action that you do, from picking up a pencil to thinking, to seeing something and perceiving what you're seeing, has a lot of different connections with neurons and neural systems, structures, and networks in the nervous system. And it's not just that. One action can have an effect on different neural structures and networks in different areas of the brain. Now, when neural structures are far, they cannot form any kind of connection between each other. But when there are two neural structures or networks that are close by, then there might be a structure that is formed through the microscopic neurons level all the way up to build up an actual neural network formed by the two previous separated neural networks. So then every time the action is repeated, when the neurons fire together, they wire together. So all these different neurons, millions of neurons that form a huge neural network formed originally by two smaller neural networks, are now all firing together, and they will keep wiring with other neurons that are also experiencing a stimulation by the specific action that is happening. And conversely, neurons that fire out of sync will fail to link. So growing up, if you had a certain habit that you kept doing over and over again, and then at a certain age you would stop this habit, what this will cause is that it will disrupt the neural structure or network that was formed because of this habit. The connection between neurons forming this neural network will start to weaken, and then the entire neural structure or network will break, and you will have several or a couple other new neural networks formed with specific neurons that are connected together, which are linked to a certain action, behavior, thought, or emotion that is repetitive and linking them together. And the rest of the neurons that were previously connected are now out of sync, which resulted in breaking the neural network. And looking at the big picture, this will change the cortical map. So let's take a few examples to understand the Hebbian theory more. Each and every time we learn a new dance step, it reflects a change in our physical brains. A new wire or neural pathway that gives instructions to our bodies on how to perform these steps will be produced inside the nervous system. So let's say you learn the robot dance, for example. Now, the more you repeat it every single time you want to dance, your mind becomes hardwired to do these moves because they're kind of natural. You've done them for such a long time. Now, every single neuron that is responsible for moving your hands in a certain way for you to be able to do the robot dance will be all connected together, forming a neural structure or a neural network that is linked to this dance step. And every single time you want to dance or you think about dancing, these neurons or neural pathways and structures and networks will fire together, thus creating a stronger link between each other, and of course, wiring your brain towards what was already wired. Now, conversely, when you stop exercising, it reflects changes in your physical brain as well. Old wires that gave instructions related to physical activities will weaken, and they might eventually disappear. Now, when we get to the part where we're going to talk about habits, you guys are going to realize that there are certain habits called keystone habits. And these keystone habits usually create a sequence of other habits. Meaning, for example, working out is one keystone habit. When you work out, you tend to eat healthier food. You tend to have more willpower. You tend to sleep better. And all of these habits are coming from only one single initial and principal habit, which is exercising. So when you've been working out for a long time, it's not just neural networks related to exercising that are working, but also neural networks related to willpowers that are getting stronger, diet and nutrition that are getting better, and sleep and resting that are getting also better. So when you stop exercising, you're not just blocking neural structure when it comes to the actual act of exercising, but you're cutting the neural network and structure between all the different keystone habits that were formed before throughout the main and principal habit. So when you're working out, this tendency in your brain that says no to junk food will bit by bit start to disappear, because this concept in your brain that you need to eat healthy because you're working out and you want to have a nice body will disappear when you start working out. And furthermore, we all know that exercising will reinforce your willpower. So all the connections between neurons and the neural network that would form through exercising that would actually reinforce your willpower will start to weaken and eventually disappear, of course. When you went to the gym for 2 years straight without skipping any days, and every single time your mind said, no, let's not go to the gym, I'm tired, you said, shut up, and you went to the gym, you reinforced your willpower. And then you went cold turkey, you stopped going to the gym all at once, even though there's this voice in your head that says you need to go, but your focus is altered towards something else. And bit by bit, you will not only lose the neural structures and networks related to exercising, but as we said, you will also lose or weaken the ones related to willpower, sleep, proper diet, and every single habit that you were doing because of the main keystone habit, which is exercising. And lastly, when you start a new habit and you stop every week, only to get back to it after 2 weeks, and you keep repeating this process, you will most likely never wire it properly in your brain. Keeping in mind that one of the most important factors when it comes to neuroplasticity is repetition and consistency, we need to talk about a big hurdle, which is your willpower, that might and will get consumed. People with New Year resolutions, they start off strong, they're doing everything right, and then their willpower gets drained. But they don't say, I want to stop all at once. They say, I'm just going to skip a day, or I'm just going to take a rest for this day. The reason why they say this and they can't just force themselves to go to the gym or to do whatever new habit or new resolution they're trying to do is because their willpower is obviously drained. Now, this neural network that was starting to slightly form, and that's still very fragile. It's still extremely fragile because you've only been doing this habit for a week and a half or two, and then you stop it all at once. This will disrupt this network and make it hard to reinforce the network and hardwire this habit again, unless you ensure consistency. Now, there are different factors when it comes to New Year resolution and why most New Year resolutions fail. But generally speaking, any habit needs repetition and consistency for it to become wired in your brain. It is most difficult when you are trying to replace one habit by the other, or you're trying to eliminate one habit to create another one. And the reason why is because most probably the old habit is already hardwired in your brain, and there is a very strong neural network and structure formed around the old habit. And this neural network will always tend to dominate on the other neural network that you're starting or trying to form that is still fragile in you, that is linked to the new habit you're trying to establish. That's exactly why you're going to see that when we talk about habits later on, we're going to say it's okay to fall back into old habits as long as you go back to the new habit and ensure consistency. There are rules like the 3-day rule, not to skip your new habit for more than 3 days, because if you do, this will affect the plasticity of your brain and how this new habit will get wired inside your brain, and of course, eliminating and changing or breaking the old neural network and structure linked to the old habit. All of this to go back to one idea that we already talked about before, which is the huge misconception of childhood and adulthood and neuroplasticity. Of course, children's brains are way more plastic and flexible than adults' brains. In fact, the brain makes the most connections among its cells before your child even turns 10. The brain also, of course, builds itself based on a lot of repetition of several experiences. Memories and, of course, interrelated experiences will start to link together. And from the moment the kid is born until the age of 3, this is where the fastest rate of brain development in the entire human lifespan happens. And that's exactly why learning, emotions, environment, experiences with kids have these long-living impact that would stay hardwired in the person's brain even when they become adults. And a very quick fact about this is that bilingual babies' brains have stronger executive functions. And the reason why is because they had more learning, therefore more experiences, and then they had more neural structures and networks formed because of different neurons connecting together. Because of these different experiences, they will eventually have more neural networks. They will have a more developed cortical map and, of course, more developed functions. And babies lose half their neurons at birth. It is believed that a baby loses about half their neurons before they are born. Their mind will simply eliminate those neurons that did not receive sufficient input from other neurons. And here we can understand a really, really important concept. Kids who have absolutely no sense of logic, they don't know what's going on, especially at birth. The only thing they have is their survival instinct, which is hardwired and implemented inside their system. And neurons that are not working with other neurons and that have no use in our brain for our survival instinct only means one thing: we don't need them. Eventually, as we said, neurons have cell bodies, and these cell bodies produce energy. So every single neuron is responsible for an energy source, and eliminating is always something that happens when kids are born. And as we said, they would lose about half their neurons before they're even born. But that doesn't mean that they can't form more neurons throughout their lives, because advanced research found out that every single person can create or can have new neurons formed in their brain. And moreover, research has found that during the second half of a child's first year, the prefrontal cortex would form synapses at an insane rate, and it consumes almost twice as much energy as an adult's brain. So any connection between neurons that was happening to form a neural network would be working at double the speed. And that's why it's way easier for them to wire stuff in their brain, have new experiences especially. It's way easier for a child to learn a new language than somebody who's 50 years old. But of course, with the concept of plasticity and neuroplasticity, this is all about to change. Even somebody who is 50 can still learn a language. It might not be as easy because, as we said, there are genes factors and there are factors related to brain aging that do happen. There are physical changes that do happen to the brain. Nonetheless, that does not mean that adults or elderly people cannot have neuroplasticity and cannot wire new things in their minds and be able to control their brain in such an extent that can take them to a whole new level, because it is always possible. And lastly, we talked about something before when we mentioned injuries. When we were talking about the cortical maps, and we said cortical maps might lead to cortical remapping in case of an injury or a trauma. In fact, neuroplasticity actually enables people to recover from many things, such as a stroke, an injury, birth abnormalities. They can improve symptoms of autism, ADD, and ADHD, learning disabilities, and other brain deficits, pull out of depression and addictions, and reverse obsessive-compulsive patterns. When a part of your brain is injured, when there's a certain trauma or injury, there's going to be a disruption of the cortical map, obviously. And what would happen? We will experience cortical remapping without even having to go through experiences and behaviors and environments, just because there was a physical trauma or injury that disrupted the cortical map. What will happen is, through neuroplasticity, a new cortical map will be formed by eliminating this structure that is not longer useful and trying to switch its functions to another set of neurons that will be connected to the main cortical map. Moreover, things related to ADHD, learning disabilities, depression, and OCD also can be solved through neuroplasticity. That's exactly why kids at a young age are being prescribed ADHD medications if they have ADHD symptoms. Because when they do take this medication, what would eventually happen is that it would become hardwired in their brain. This level of focus and concentration and euphoria that they get sometimes through the ADHD medications will become hardwired in their brain. And if they take the medication long enough, of course, depending on different factors, including the person himself and his genes, but it is a high possibility that there's going to be a neuroplastic change in the mind where it becomes wired to the ADHD medication even when you're not taking it anymore. Depressive patterns and addictions can also be solved through neuroplasticity. With a flexible and plastic mind, you can change everything, and everything is possible. And we're going to look way more into what you can do in future lectures.